Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone. My wife and I saw a UFO together while driving on the highway between British Columbia and Alberta. I still hesitate a little when I use the word UFO because it comes with so much baggage. The moment you say it, people picture little green men, flying saucers, conspiracy theories, secret military bases, or someone who has decided every strange light in the sky must be an alien spacecraft. That is not how I think about it. I use the word only because I do not have another one. It was an unidentified flying object, something in the sky that neither of us could explain, something we both saw clearly enough to agree that it was there, but strange enough that we have never been able to fit it into any normal category. Over the years, we have talked about it more times than we probably should have. It comes up during long drives. It comes up when we see an unusual cloud formation, a bright planet, a distant plane, or lights moving over the mountains. It comes up when someone tells a story about something strange they saw in the sky. At this point, I am sure there are at least a few people in our lives who are tired of hearing about it. We know. We probably sound repetitive. We have told the story enough times that we can see the look people get when they realize it is about to come up again. The polite smile, the pause, the little expression that says, "Here we go." But it is hard not to bring it up. It was one of those experiences that never fully settles into the past. Most memories become smaller over time. You remember the general shape of something, but lose the details. A trip becomes a few pictures. A conversation becomes a feeling. A place you used to visit often becomes a road name, a restaurant, a certain smell in the air. But this has never faded in the same way. The details of the object itself are difficult to explain, but the feeling of seeing it remains completely clear. We were driving between British Columbia and Alberta on a highway we have traveled many times. It is not some route we took once in our lives. It is familiar to us. We know the turns. We know the stretches where the road opens up. We know the sections where the landscape changes, where the mountains rise, where the long drive begins to feel endless, and where you start recognizing landmarks that tell you how much farther you have to go. We drive that highway several times a year. That matters because it was not an unfamiliar setting where we could easily misunderstand what we were looking at. We know the road. We know what the sky normally looks like over it. We know what airplanes look like at a distance. We know what headlights look like far away. We know the difference between a plane moving slowly across the horizon, a helicopter holding position, a satellite moving in a straight line, or a bright planet sitting low in the sky. We have seen clouds catch the sun in strange ways. We have seen reflections in windows. We have seen weather shift quickly over the mountains. We have seen lights from distant towns and vehicles moving on roads that are not immediately obvious. We have spent enough time on that highway to know that the landscape can play tricks on you. But this was not one of those tricks. I do not remember every small detail of the day we saw it. I do not remember what we had eaten before we left, what music was playing in the car, or exactly where we had stopped last. I cannot tell you the exact minute it appeared, or the exact kilometer marker we were near. But I remember that we were both there. I remember that neither of us was alone. And I remember the moment we realized we were looking at something we could not explain. The object was in the sky, visible from the highway as we drove. At first, I think we both assumed it had to be something ordinary. That is what people do. You see something unusual, and your mind immediately starts offering explanations. It is a plane. It is a helicopter. It is a drone. It is a reflection. It is a bright object farther away than it looks. It is a weather balloon. It is a star or planet seen through thin cloud. There are always possibilities. The world is full of things that can look strange from a distance. But the longer we watched it, the less any of those explanations worked. It did not move like an airplane. That was one of the first things we noticed. Planes travel in a way that makes sense. Even when they are far away, you can understand the direction they are going. They move forward. They turn gradually. They climb or descend. Their speed may be hard to judge from the ground, but their movement still follows a pattern you recognize. This object did not. It moved in a way that was so unfamiliar that I still have trouble describing it without sounding like I am exaggerating. It was not simply fast. There are plenty of things that move fast. Jets move fast. Birds can move quickly. Drones can dart around in strange ways. A distant object can seem to jump because of perspective, especially if clouds or terrain partially hide it. But this was different. The object seemed to move without the kind of transition you expect from anything physical. It did not appear to build speed. It did not seem to bank or turn in a smooth curve. It did not drift gradually from one place to another. It changed position in a way that made no sense to either of us. I remember watching it and feeling the normal rules in my mind stop working. There are certain things you accept without thinking about them. If an object moves, it has to get from one point to another. If it turns, it has to change direction. If it accelerates, you expect some kind of gradual increase in speed. Even when something is far away, you can usually understand the basic motion. This thing seemed to ignore that. Not literally. Maybe. I cannot claim it broke physics. I do not know what it was, how far away it was, or what conditions might have affected what we saw. But from where we were, it looked as though it was moving in ways that did not match anything we knew. It would be in one position, then somewhere else. It would move in a way that made it difficult to follow with your eyes. It had an unnatural quality to it, not because it looked like a science fiction spaceship, but because its movement felt disconnected from the normal world around it. That was the eerie part. It was not scary in the way a person following you at night is scary. It was not threatening. It did not come toward the car. It did not react to us in any obvious way. Neither of us felt like we were in danger. But there was still something unsettling about it. When you see something that seems to move outside the rules you have understood your whole life, it creates a strange feeling. It is not panic exactly. It is more like your brain becomes uncomfortable because it cannot organize what it is seeing. You look at it and think, that cannot be right. Then you look again, and it is still happening. I remember my wife and I talking about it as we watched. At first, I am sure we were both trying to make sense of it. Is that a plane? No, it cannot be. Maybe it is a helicopter. It is moving too strangely. Could it be a drone? Not at that distance. Not like that. We went through the normal list. We tried to be reasonable. Maybe it was something military. Maybe it was some kind of aircraft we did not recognize. Maybe it was a weather balloon caught in unusual wind currents. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by the mountains, clouds, or windshield. But nothing fit. The more we watched, the more obvious it became that we were both witnessing the same thing. That is another reason it has stayed with us. If I had been alone, I would have doubted myself more. I would have blamed fatigue, distance, imagination, or a strange angle in the sky. I would have wondered whether I had misjudged the size or speed of something ordinary. But my wife saw it too. She reacted to the same movements I did. She noticed the same impossible-looking changes in direction and speed. She was not just agreeing with me after I described it. We were watching it together in real time. There was no question afterward about whether it had happened. The question was only what it had been, and we still do not know. After the object was gone, the drive continued. The highway became normal again. The mountains were still there. The sky was still there. Cars passed. The road stretched forward. Everything looked exactly the way it had before, and yet it did not feel the same. For a while we kept talking about it. Then we would go quiet. Then one of us would bring it up again. We would replay the movement. We would try to remember where it first appeared. We would argue gently over whether it had changed direction before or after it moved farther away. We would try to compare it to planes we had seen before. We would wonder whether there had been some kind of known event in the area that day. But no explanation ever felt satisfying. Over the years, we have searched for answers in different ways. We have considered weather balloons. We have considered drones. We have considered military aircraft. We have considered experimental aircraft. We have considered reflections and atmospheric distortions. We have considered the possibility that something in the car window made an ordinary object look like it was moving strangely. We have considered whether we were tired. Long drives can affect you. You can get tunnel vision. You can stare at the same stretch of road for too long and lose your sense of distance. The sky can look deceptive when mountains fill the horizon. A light can seem to move because the car itself is moving. We know all of that. We have not ignored the logical possibilities. In fact, we have probably spent more time trying to find a rational explanation than anyone else would. We wanted one. We still do. It would be comforting to know that it was a rare aircraft, a research balloon, an atmospheric effect, or a distant object seen under unusual conditions. We do not need it to be alien. We do not need it to be paranormal. We do not need it to be anything extraordinary. We just want it to make sense. But every explanation falls apart when we return to the movement. That is the thing neither of us can get past. Whatever it was, it did not move like anything else we have ever seen. Not like an airplane, not like a bird, not like a helicopter, not like a drone, not like something caught in the wind, not like a light reflecting on glass. It moved in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar. And once you have seen something like that, it becomes difficult to explain it away. We still drive that highway many times each year. Every trip, there is always a small part of us that looks toward the sky. We do not make a big deal out of it every time. Sometimes one of us will joke about it. Sometimes we will point at a distant plane and say, maybe that is it. Sometimes we just watch the horizon quietly. But we always look. We always hope, in some strange way, to see it again. That might sound odd, considering how unsettling the first experience was. But it was not frightening, in the way danger is frightening. We were not traumatized by it. We did not feel attacked. We did not feel chased. We simply saw something so unusual that it left us with more questions than answers. Part of us wants to see it again because maybe a second sighting would give us more information. Maybe we would notice its shape better. Maybe we could record it. Maybe we could compare the movement to the first time. Maybe we could identify a pattern. Maybe another sighting would finally make the experience feel less impossible. Or maybe it would only make it stranger. So far, we have never seen it again. We have driven the same highway in different seasons, different weather, different times of day, and different conditions. We have seen countless planes, bright stars, distant lights, clouds over the mountains, birds crossing the road, and all kinds of normal things. But never that object, never that movement, never that same impossible-looking shift through the sky. It appears to have been a one-time event. Sometimes I wonder whether that is why we keep talking about it. Because there was no ending. Nothing came from it afterward. No news report appeared that explained it. No one we knew called us and said they had seen the same thing. We did not capture a video. We did not pull over and find other people staring upward. We did not later discover it had been a known event. It happened. Then, it was gone, and all we were left with was the memory. There are experiences that become stories because they have a clear beginning, middle, and end. You see something, you understand it, you explain it, you move on. This was not like that. This was an unfinished story. Two people driving on a familiar road between British Columbia and Alberta. A strange object appearing in the sky. Movement that seemed completely unlike anything either of us had ever seen. Then the object disappearing and leaving us with no answer. Years later, we can still talk about it for too long. We can still debate what it might have been. We can still try to make the movement fit into some ordinary explanation. And we can still look up every time we drive that highway, hoping that maybe it will return. I do not know if it was extraterrestrial. I do not know if it was military. I do not know if it was a rare natural phenomenon or a normal object seen in a way that fooled both of us. I only know that we saw something. And whatever it was, it made the world feel briefly less certain than it had before. Not terrifying, not threatening, just strange. Strange enough that even now, when we are driving that familiar highway through British Columbia and Alberta, we still watch the sky. When I was around 12 years old, I had a dream that still bothers me because I never found a good explanation for what happened afterward. At that age, I was old enough to know the difference between a regular bad dream and something that felt unusually real. I had nightmares before. Most kids do. You dream about being chased, getting lost, monsters hiding in the dark, or something happening to someone you love. Then you wake up, your heart is racing, and after a few minutes you realize you are safe in your own room. This was not like that. It started as a dream. At least I think it did. I remember being asleep in my room. Everything looked almost exactly the way it really looked at night. The furniture was where it belonged. The window was where it should have been. The door was shut, or nearly shut, and the room had that dim, familiar darkness that makes you able to recognize shapes without seeing details. Nothing about the dream world looked different from real life. That was the first thing that made it hard to separate from reality later. In the dream, my bedroom door opened. I remember staring toward it from my bed. At first, I thought it was my mom. That was normal. If I woke up at night and heard the door open, my first thought would have been that one of my parents was checking on me, asking if I was okay, or coming in because they heard something. But the person who came through the doorway was not my mom. It was a figure wearing a mask that looked like the one from Scream. The long white face, the dark hollow eyes, the stretched, open mouth. Even as a kid, I knew what that mask was. It was recognizable immediately, even in the darkness of the room. It was one of those faces that looks exaggerated and almost silly when you see it in a store or on a movie cover, but becomes completely different when you imagine it standing in your bedroom at night. The figure stepped into my room. It was dressed in dark clothing. I could not clearly remember every part of what it wore afterward, only that the mask stood out sharply against everything else. The white face seemed too bright in the darkness. Then it started screaming my name. But the voice was my mom's. That was the worst part. It was not a stranger's voice. It was not a monster voice. It was not the deep, distorted voice you would expect from someone wearing a horror mask. It sounded like my mother, not exactly the way she normally spoke to me during the day. It sounded harsher, louder, and angrier than I was used to hearing, but it was still her voice. I recognized the tone. I recognized the way my name sounded when she said it. The figure screamed my name over and over. I remember lying in bed, terrified, not understanding why my mom's voice was coming from behind that mask. Then it started hitting me. I do not know exactly what it was holding. It felt like some kind of whip or belt, something long, thin, and flexible. The figure swung it down across me again and again, striking my legs and thighs. I remember the sharp sting of it. I remember flinching and trying to pull away. I remember the feeling of being trapped in the bed, unable to make the dream stop. It was not like a normal nightmare where you are watching something happen from far away. I felt it. Every time it struck, I felt a sharp, burning pain. I tried to scream. I tried to call for my mom, but my voice would not work properly. It either came out too quietly or it did not come out at all. I remember trying to move, trying to pull the blanket up, trying to get away from the edge of the bed, but the figure kept yelling my name, my mom's voice. My name shouted from behind that white, screaming mask. I remember thinking, this cannot be my mom. I remember thinking, why does it sound like her? And then I woke up. At least, I thought I woke up. I opened my eyes in my actual bedroom. The room was dark. The furniture was where it should have been. My blankets were around me. For a split second, I felt relief. I thought it was over. I thought I had only had a terrible dream. Then I saw the figure. It was still in my room. It stood near the doorway, or closer to the door than it had been before. I cannot remember the exact distance, only that it was still there. The same mask, the same shape, the same dark clothing, and it was still screaming my name in my mom's voice. I froze. I did not sit up. I did not run. I could not make myself move. The figure seemed to be leaving, but it did not leave quickly. It moved slowly toward the door, as though it had all the time in the world. The screaming continued while it backed away or turned toward the hallway. Then it went through the doorway. I watched it from my bed. I watched the room beyond the door, and I watched the door close. Slowly, not slam, not swing shut from a draft. It closed with the controlled movement of someone pulling it from the other side. The figure was gone. The room was quiet, but I stayed exactly where I was. I do not know how long I lay there. It felt like forever. I kept staring at the door. I expected it to open again. I expected the masked figure to come back. I expected to hear my name in my mother's voice from the hallway. I waited for footsteps. I waited for the sound of someone moving around the house. Nothing happened. The house was completely silent. At first, I tried to tell myself I was still dreaming. That seemed like the only explanation. I had been asleep. The whole thing began as a nightmare. Maybe I had not truly woken up at all. Maybe I was trapped in some strange second dream, the kind where you think you wake up, but you are actually still asleep. I had heard of that happening to people. You dream that you wake up in your own room. You see everything as it normally is. You think the nightmare is over. Then something impossible happens, and you realize you are still dreaming. Maybe that was it. I kept trying to convince myself of that. But my body felt awake. My eyes were open. I could feel the texture of the blanket beneath my fingers. I could hear the quiet sounds of the house settling. I could see the faint light around the edges of the curtains. Everything felt too solid. I remember being afraid to move because I thought that if I got out of bed, the figure would be waiting in the hall. But after a while, I needed to use the bathroom. The bathroom was across the hall from my room. Even thinking about opening the door made my stomach twist. I lay there trying to wait until I did not need to go anymore. I hoped I could fall asleep again, because sleeping somehow felt safer than leaving my bed. But I could not sleep. The dream, the figure, the voice, the pain in my legs, it all kept replaying in my mind. Eventually, I forced myself up. I moved slowly. I remember keeping the blanket around me for a moment, as though I could somehow bring part of the bed's safety with me. Then I stood up and looked toward the door. Nothing was there. The room was empty. I opened the door carefully. The hallway was dark and quiet. There was no masked figure, no one standing outside my sister's room or near the bathroom. No sound coming from my parents' room. I crossed the hall and went into the bathroom. I turned on the light. Then I saw the marks. They were across my thighs, red lines, long marks that looked like belt marks. At first, I just stared at them. I could not understand what I was seeing. For a second, I thought maybe I was still dreaming. I touched one of the marks. They were real. My skin was sore where the lines crossed it. Not badly injured, not bleeding, but the marks were there, clear enough that I knew I had not imagined them. They looked too much like the places where the figure had hit me in the dream. That was when I became truly terrified. Before that, there had still been a possibility that the whole thing was only a nightmare. A horrible nightmare, but nothing more. I could have told myself I dreamed the mask, dreamed the voice, dreamed the door closing, but I was standing in the bathroom with the lights on, looking at marks on my thighs that seemed to match something that happened while I slept. I did not know how they got there. I had not fallen. I had not been injured earlier that day, at least not in any way I remembered. I had not been wearing anything tight enough to leave marks like that. I had not been playing outside or doing something that could explain long lines across both thighs. I stood there for what felt like a long time, staring at them. Then I checked the rest of the house. I do not know whether I did it because I was brave or because I was too scared not to. I needed to know whether someone had actually entered the house. I needed to know whether my mom had come into my room for some reason, whether someone else had been awake, whether there was any normal explanation waiting just a few steps away. I went to everyone's rooms, one by one. I checked my parents first. They were asleep, not pretending, not lying awake and waiting for me. They were both sound asleep. The room was dark. Their breathing was slow and normal. There was no sign that either of them had been up recently. I checked the other rooms in the house too. Everyone was asleep. No doors were open in a strange way. No lights were on. No one was standing in the hall. No one looked like they had been moving through the house. I went back to the bathroom and looked at the marks again. They were still there. I remember wanting to wake someone up and tell them what happened. But I did not know how. What was I supposed to say? I had a dream that a person in a scream mask came into my room, screamed my name in Mom's voice, hit me, and then I woke up with marks on my legs. Even as a child, I knew how impossible that sounded. I was afraid no one would believe me. I was afraid they would say I had scratched myself while sleeping, or rolled into something, or imagined the whole thing because I had watched something scary. Maybe they would tell me I had a nightmare and needed to calm down. Maybe they would tell me the marks had been there before and I had not noticed. Maybe they would be right. But I did not want to hear any of that because it did not explain what I felt. The figure had been in my room, or at least it had felt like it was. The voice had been my mom's. or close enough to my mom's that I could not separate the two. The pain in my thighs had been real, and the door had closed. I still remember that door closing. It was not a dramatic slam. It was not some loud horror movie moment. It was worse, because it was quiet. The figure leaving my room as though it knew exactly where it was going. The door moving slowly after it. The soft click when it shut. Then nothing. For years after that, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe I had a nightmare that became a false awakening. That would explain why I saw the figure after I thought I woke up. It would explain why the room looked real but still contained something impossible. People can have vivid dreams where they wake up inside the dream and see figures, hear voices, or feel sensations that seem completely physical. Maybe I had sleep paralysis. I do not remember being unable to move for the entire experience, but fear can make you feel frozen even when your body is technically awake. During sleep paralysis, people can see shadow figures, hear someone speaking, feel pressure on their body, or become convinced that someone is in the room. Maybe the figure was part of that. Maybe the voice was my mind using the most familiar voice it knew to make the dream more frightening. Maybe the mask came from something I had seen on television, in a movie preview, at a store, or in a costume display. Even if I had not watched the actual film, the image of that mask was everywhere for a long time. It was easy for a child's brain to pull it into a nightmare. That all makes sense. But the marks are what I cannot get past. I have tried to come up with explanations. Maybe I had pressed against something in my sleep. Maybe a wrinkle in the bedding, a seam, a piece of clothing, or something under the blanket had left lines on my skin. Maybe I scratched myself without realizing it. Maybe I had been sitting against something earlier in the day and only noticed the marks after the nightmare made me look. Those explanations are possible. They may even be the most likely ones. Bodies can develop marks for reasons we do not notice right away. Skin can react to pressure, fabric, heat, or friction. A person can wake up with lines or bruises and have no memory of what caused them. But when you are 12 years old, standing under a bright bathroom light in the middle of the night, and those marks are in the same place where a figure hit you in a dream, it does not feel like coincidence. It feels like proof. That was what scared me. Not that I thought the figure had literally entered the house wearing a costume. Not that I thought my mother had done something to me. I knew that made no sense. I knew my mom was asleep. I knew everyone was asleep. I knew a person in a mask could not simply vanish while closing the door behind them. But I could not make the experience fit into anything normal either. I had seen something. I had heard something. I had felt pain. Then I found marks, and no one in the house had been awake. I do not know whether I ever told my family about it in full detail. I may have mentioned the marks, but not the dream. I may have kept the whole thing to myself, because saying it out loud made it feel worse. Sometimes, experiences are hard to share because you do not want anyone to look at you differently. You do not want them to think you are making things up. You do not want them to say it was just a dream when every part of you remembers it as something more. Even now, I do not know what happened that night. Maybe it was a nightmare layered with a false awakening. Maybe the marks had a completely ordinary cause. Maybe fear linked two unrelated things in my memory and made them seem connected. Maybe I was a scared 12-year-old who woke up with unexplained lines on my skin and built a story around them because the dream had been so vivid. That is possible. But I still remember the mask. I still remember the scream. I still remember my name being shouted in my mother's voice. I still remember the feeling of the strikes across my legs. And I still remember standing in the bathroom afterward, looking at red marks that should not have been there. The house was quiet. Everyone was asleep. and I was completely alone with the question of whether I had just woken up from a nightmare or whether something had come into my room while I slept. My eldest brother and his wife used to hear strange things downstairs through the baby intercom. At first, they tried not to make too much of it. They were new parents, exhausted most of the time, and living in the kind of routine where sleep becomes broken into small pieces. A baby cries, a parent wakes. A floorboard creaks, a parent wakes. The house settles, the heating clicks on, a pipe knocks somewhere behind a wall, and suddenly you are lying in bed wide awake, listening to every sound because your child is sleeping in another room. The baby monitor made it worse. It was one of the older style intercom systems, always picking up little noises from downstairs. Sometimes it carried static. Sometimes it picked up a distant sound from another room more clearly than it should have. Sometimes they would hear the soft hum of appliances, the house creaking, or a faint scrape that could have been a chair moving on its own or a pet shifting somewhere out of sight. They had tried to explain everything normally. Old houses are noisy. Homes have their own rhythms. Wood expands and contracts. Heating systems come on at night. Water moves through pipes. A loose object can vibrate. A door can settle in its frame. If you are tired enough, ordinary sounds become louder and stranger than they really are. But the noises downstairs kept happening. Sometimes it sounded as though somebody was moving around after everyone had gone to bed. Not loud enough to make them immediately call the police or run downstairs with a weapon. More like quiet signs of activity. A soft thump. A creak from the floor below. A faint rustle. The sound of something shifting in a room that should have been empty. My brother and his wife would lie there listening to the monitor, trying to decide whether one of them should get up and check. Most of the time, one of them did. They would go downstairs and find nothing. The doors would be locked. The windows would be closed. The living room would be empty. Nothing would be out of place. The house would look exactly as it had before they went to bed. Eventually, they started doing what most people do with strange things that never produce evidence. They tried to ignore them. But there was one night they could not ignore. It was late. The baby was asleep upstairs, and the house had settled into that deep silence that only happens when everyone inside has finally gone to bed. My brother and his wife were in their room, probably trying to rest while still listening to the monitor the way new parents do. At some point, they heard something downstairs through the intercom. It was not one of the usual small noises. It was unusual enough that my brother got up to investigate. I do not know exactly what the sound was. Maybe it was a voice like noise, a thump, a series of creaks, or something that sounded like movement moving through the house. Whatever it was, it made him feel that he needed to check downstairs instead of simply turning over and trying to sleep. He left the bedroom and stepped into the upstairs hallway. That was when he saw his daughter. She was on the landing, walking toward the stairs. At first, he must have thought his eyes were not working properly. The landing was dim, probably lit only by a hallway nightlight or faint light coming from another room. He was tired. He had just woken up. His brain may have been struggling to understand what he was seeing, but there she was, his baby, moving across the landing. She was heading toward the stairs. My brother reacted immediately. He rushed forward and caught her just before she could tumble down the staircase. It was not some small step or a baby crawling near the edge. From the way the story was told, she was moving in a way that looked like walking. She was upright enough that my brother believed she was about to go down the stairs. He grabbed her before she fell. The terrifying part was not only that she was near the stairs in the middle of the night. It was her age. She was barely 6 months old. She did not actually learn to walk, until she was almost a year old. That was what made the memory impossible for him to explain. At 6 months, she should not have been walking across a landing. She should not have been able to leave her sleeping area, move down the hall, and reach the top of the stairs without waking one of her parents. She should not have been physically capable of walking in the way he remembered seeing her walk. And yet, he had caught her. He had felt her in his arms. She had been there. There was no question that he had not just seen a shadow or a shape. He had picked up his daughter. Afterward, he and his wife tried to understand what had happened. Maybe she had somehow crawled out of her bed or crib. Maybe she had moved in a strange way that looked like walking because of the dim light. Maybe he had been partially asleep and misunderstood the shape of her movement. Those explanations would make sense in another situation. A tired parent can wake up disoriented. In low light, a crawling child might look different than they do in daylight. A baby can surprise you with what they are capable of, especially during a stage where they are learning to stand, pull themselves up, shuffle, or move sideways while holding on to furniture. But my brother was certain about what he saw. He said she was walking, and the detail that stayed with everyone was that she had not learned to walk until months later. That incident did not make them leave the house immediately. They tried to carry on. They were parents with a baby. Life did not stop because something strange happened. There were bottles to prepare, diapers to change, work to go to, laundry to wash, bills to pay, and sleep to catch whenever they could. But the house became harder for them to ignore. The strange sounds continued. The baby monitor still picked up things downstairs. Sometimes my brother would hear something in the living room late at night, then go down and find the room empty. Sometimes his wife would say she felt uneasy being alone in certain parts of the house. There was an atmosphere in the place that seemed to build slowly over time, the way a bad feeling can grow when every strange sound becomes connected to the last one. Eventually, his wife brought in someone she described as a spiritualist. I do not know who the woman was exactly. Maybe she was someone recommended by a friend, someone who claimed to be sensitive to spirits, or someone people called when they wanted answers that ordinary explanations did not provide. By that point, my brother and his wife were desperate enough to listen. The spiritualist walked through the house and told them she sensed something there. According to her, the presence was jealous of my brother. She said it wanted his attention, and because it could not get to him the way it wanted, it would try to reach him through the people closest to him, through his daughter. That was one of the things she said that frightened his wife most. The baby had already been found at the top of the stairs in a way neither parent could explain. Whether it had been sleep deprivation, a strange misunderstanding, or something else entirely, the memory was enough to make any parent afraid. Then the spiritualist said something else. She claimed the presence was connected to a mirror. There was a mirror in the house that my brother spent a lot of time in front of. He was not necessarily vain in some extreme way, but like many people, he used it while getting ready, shaving, fixing his hair, checking his clothes, or simply passing through the room. The spiritualist said that whatever was in the house lived behind the mirror. She said it watched him from there. She said that when he stood in front of it and looked at himself, something else was looking back. That is the kind of statement that sounds ridiculous in daylight. It sounds like something from a horror movie or a story told around a campfire. A being living behind a mirror. A jealous presence staring out from the other side of the glass. It is easy to laugh at because it is so familiar as a supernatural idea. My brother was skeptical. He did not suddenly become convinced because a stranger told him a dramatic story about the mirror. He may have felt unsettled, but he was not someone who automatically believed every paranormal explanation offered to him. Still, the idea stayed in the house. Once someone tells you a mirror is haunted, it becomes difficult to look into it the same way. You start noticing reflections in the corner of your eye. You start seeing the darkness behind your own reflection. You start wondering whether a room looks different in a mirror than it does when you turn around. That night, something happened that made the spiritualist's words much harder for him to dismiss. My brother was asleep. His wife was beside him. At some point during the night, he suddenly began struggling, not tossing and turning in an ordinary nightmare, not shifting in his sleep the way everyone does. He looked like he was fighting something. His wife saw it happen. She woke up and found him moving violently, trying to throw something off of himself. He was twisting, bucking, and using all his strength as though he had something heavy on his chest or back. At first, she may have thought he was having a nightmare, but he was fighting too hard. He was trying to push something away, trying to roll over, trying to get free. The struggle was physical enough that she could see he was not simply mumbling in his sleep. When he woke, he was terrified. He said something had been attacking him. He described a presence on him, something he could not fully see, but could feel with crushing weight. He had tried to buck it off, to shove it away, to get it out of the room. The experience could have been sleep paralysis. That is the obvious explanation, and it is important to acknowledge. During sleep paralysis, people can wake with a crushing sensation on their chest or body. They may feel unable to move. They may see figures in the room, hear voices, sense something sitting on them, or become convinced that they are being attacked. Sleep paralysis can be terrifying. It can feel completely real. It can create vivid, specific images. But the situation was complicated by the fact that his wife had seen him struggling. She had not seen an invisible figure. She had not seen a creature in the room. But she had seen him fighting something in his sleep with a level of panic that did not look like an ordinary nightmare. Afterward, the spiritualist was called back. She asked him questions about what he saw. Then she said something that shocked him. She told him the thing would have been wearing a mask. He froze, because he said that was correct. He had seen a mask. He had not told her that detail first, at least according to the story. He had not given her enough information for her to guess it. He had only described being attacked and feeling as though something was on him. But she said mask, and he remembered the mask. The face behind it was not human in the ordinary sense. The spiritualist told him it was probably a wolf. My brother laughed. He was skeptical enough that the idea of a wolf-masked entity felt too specific and too theatrical. He could not take it seriously. A wolf mask sounded like something invented to make the story scarier. So he laughed it off. Immediately, she corrected herself. If not a wolf, she said, then a lion. That was what he had seen. Not a wolf, a lion, or something with the face, shape, or mask of a lion. That was the point where the story stopped being something they could easily shrug off. Even if you do not believe in spiritualists, even if you believe every paranormal experience has a psychological or physical explanation, there is something unsettling about a stranger saying a detail that matches a private nightmare. It might have been luck. It might have been a broad guess. Wolf and lion are both common symbolic animals. It might have been my brother's reaction to the first suggestion that led her to the second. Maybe she saw something in his face when she said wolf and adjusted quickly. There are many ways a reading can feel accurate without being supernatural. But to him, it felt like confirmation. And to his wife, it was too much. She had already been afraid because of the sounds on the intercom. She had already been frightened by the night their barely 6-month-old daughter appeared to be walking near the stairs. She had already listened to someone describe a jealous presence in the house that might target the baby because it could not reach her husband. Then she watched her husband fight something unseen in his sleep. Then the spiritualist described a masked creature with an animal face that matched what he remembered. She could not live there anymore. She moved out with the baby. The relationship did not survive much longer after that. They divorced soon afterward. I do not know whether the house was truly haunted. I do not know whether there was an entity behind the mirror watching my brother while he got ready each day. I do not know whether a presence could become jealous, or whether it could target a child, or whether any of the spiritualist's explanations were true. I do not know whether the baby was actually walking, or whether a sleep-deprived father saw a crawling child in low light and later remembered it differently. I do not know whether my brother's attack was sleep paralysis, a night terror, or something more disturbing. I do not know whether the spiritualist was sensitive, lucky, manipulative, or simply skilled at reading frightened people. But I do know the events changed the family. The house became associated with fear. The mirror became more than a mirror. The baby monitor became something they dreaded hearing in the middle of the night. The upstairs landing became the place where my brother caught his daughter before she fell, and the bed became the place where he fought something he could not explain. There are some experiences that stay frightening because they are violent or dramatic. This one is frightening because it grew slowly. It began with little sounds downstairs, things that could have been pipes, old floorboards, static on an intercom, or the normal noises of a house at night. Then it became a baby near the stairs. Then a spiritualist saying something was jealous. Then a mirror. Then a masked face. Then a marriage ending under the weight of fear, exhaustion, grief, and a home that no longer felt safe. Maybe every part of it has an ordinary explanation. Maybe the sounds came from the house settling. Maybe the baby's movement was misunderstood in low light. Maybe the attack was sleep paralysis. Maybe the reading was built from guesses and reactions. Maybe the relationship ended for reasons that had nothing to do with anything paranormal. That is all possible. But when enough strange things happen in the same house, normal explanations can begin to feel thin. And once a family starts wondering whether something is in the home with them, every sound becomes heavier. Every reflection becomes suspicious. Every late-night noise feels like a warning. For my brother and his wife, the scariest part was never just the sound on the baby monitor. It was the feeling that something had noticed their family. Something that was not satisfied with being heard downstairs. Something that wanted to be seen. A few years ago, my two brothers and I were upstairs near my parents' room, talking with my parents before everyone went to bed. There were 5 of us there in total. My mom and dad were nearby, and my brothers and I were gathered in the upstairs hallway, the way families sometimes are at the end of the night. Nobody was doing anything important. There was no party, no movie playing, no dramatic conversation. We were just lingering before bed, talking about whatever had happened that day. The house was quiet in the normal nighttime way. The lights upstairs were on, but most of the downstairs lights had probably been turned off already. The hallway had that familiar feeling it always had at night, quieter than during the day, slightly warmer from the heat rising through the house, with all the bedroom doors nearby and the sound of everyone gradually getting ready to sleep. It was late enough that nobody should have been coming over. Our grandfather certainly should not have been coming over. He had a very recognizable way of entering our house. Every single time he came in, he would say the same thing. "Hello, hello." He did not say it loudly in an exaggerated way. It was just his greeting. It was his habit. He would open the door, come inside, and call out, "Hello, hello," before he found whoever was home. It was so familiar that none of us really thought about it when he was actually there. It was simply Grandpa. You would hear the door, then his voice, and you would know he had arrived. That night, though, he had not come over. There was no reason for him to. It was too late, and he never came by that late at night anyway. If he had been planning to visit, someone would have known. He would have called. He would not have randomly shown up after everyone was already upstairs preparing for bed. We were standing in the hallway talking when both of my brothers suddenly stopped. At first, I did not understand why. Their faces changed at almost the same time. One of them looked toward the stairs or down the hallway. The other looked at him, confused. Then they both said they had heard something. They had heard a voice say, "Hello? Hello?" It sounded like our grandfather, not just a random person saying the same words. Not a voice from the television, because there was no television on upstairs. Not someone speaking outside, because the sound had seemed close. They both recognized it immediately as the greeting our grandfather always used. "Hello? Hello?" For a moment, everyone just stood there. I remember the strange pause that followed. When something happens in a familiar house, people do not always react right away. Your brain tries to make it ordinary before it lets you be scared. Maybe someone heard something from another room. Maybe a neighbor walked past outside. Maybe a phone was playing a video. Maybe one person misheard and the other person got influenced by the reaction. But both of my brothers had heard it, and they had both heard the same thing. They looked at each other because neither of them could understand why our grandfather would be at the house so late. My parents were confused too. I do not know whether I heard it as clearly as they did. I remember being there and seeing their reactions. I remember knowing immediately what they thought they had heard, because Grandpa's greeting was so specific. He always said it exactly like that. "Hello? Hello?" There was something about the way my brothers reacted that made it impossible to laugh it off. They were not trying to scare anyone. They did not look amused. They did not look like they were setting up a joke. They looked genuinely confused. One of them may have asked, "Was that Grandpa?" The other agreed that it sounded like him. That was when the adults started trying to figure out whether there could be an explanation. Maybe Grandpa had called the house. Maybe someone had left a voicemail playing somewhere. Maybe the sound came from a television downstairs, or from a phone in another room. Maybe he had come over and was outside, though that did not make sense, because nobody had heard the front door, nobody had heard a car pull up, and nobody had seen anyone downstairs. The house was quiet. No door had opened. No footsteps came up the stairs. No voice called again. Just those two words. "Hello? Hello?" Then, silence. My dad decided to call Grandpa. It was late, and I think everyone already knew he would probably be asleep. But my dad wanted to make sure. Maybe Grandpa had been trying to reach us. Maybe he had come by and left. Maybe there was some normal reason connected to the sound. So he called his house. The phone rang. Nobody answered. That did not prove anything. Of course, it only meant Grandpa was not picking up his phone. But at that hour, it made sense that he would be asleep. My dad may have tried more than once. No answer. There was no indication that Grandpa was awake, outside, driving around, or anywhere near our house. The whole thing was over quickly. No one appeared downstairs. No one knocked. No car pulled into the driveway. Grandpa did not call back a few minutes later to say he had accidentally dialed us or that he had been nearby. Nothing else happened. But the sound stayed with my brothers. It stayed with all of us because it was too specific. If they had heard a random creak, a voice-like sound, or someone saying a word that could have come from anywhere, it would have been easier to explain away. Old houses carry sound strangely. Pipes can make strange noises. A voice from outside can travel farther than you expect. A television or radio from another room can seem closer than it is. But this was our grandfather's greeting. The same greeting he used every time he entered the house. The same two words, spoken in the same familiar way. Hello? Hello? And both brothers heard it. That was the part nobody could explain. I have thought about possible answers since then. Maybe one of my brothers heard a sound that vaguely resembled a voice, and the other brother picked up on it after seeing his reaction. Once one person says, "Did you hear Grandpa?" the brain can begin filling in details. Sound is strange like that. People hear patterns in noise all the time, especially familiar words and familiar voices. Maybe something downstairs made a sound that repeated twice. Maybe a door or vent created a noise that seemed like hello, hello. Maybe one of the pipes shifted, and the sound happened to have a rhythm that reminded them of him. But that explanation has always felt weak. They did not just say they heard a voice. They both independently recognized the same phrase. They both thought of Grandpa. And they both knew he had no reason to be there. Another possibility is that a television or phone was playing somewhere in the house. Maybe someone had left something on downstairs. Maybe a video was playing. Maybe an ad, a show, or a voicemail had the exact words in it. But nobody found anything. The house was quiet. There was no television on where it could have carried upstairs. No phone was playing audio. No device was found making noise. Maybe someone outside said it. Maybe a person walking down the street called out to someone. Maybe a neighbor came home and greeted someone nearby. At night, voices can travel strangely, especially when the neighborhood is quiet. But again, the sound seemed too familiar, too close, and the timing was strange. It was as if someone had entered the house the way Grandpa always did, even though no one had entered. It was not frightening in the same way a shadow figure or an unexplained bang might be frightening. Nobody saw anyone. Nobody felt threatened. Nobody heard footsteps climbing the stairs. The strange part was how warm and familiar the voice was. It was not an unknown voice. It was someone we loved. Someone whose greeting was part of the normal rhythm of our family. That made the moment feel less like a typical ghost story and more like a mistake in reality. Like the house had replayed something it remembered. Like a sound from another time had somehow found its way into that hallway. I do not know whether Grandpa was asleep at that exact moment. We assumed he was because he did not answer the phone. Maybe he had gone to bed early. Maybe his phone was in another room. Maybe he simply did not hear it ring. Later, he may have told us he was asleep or that he had not been anywhere near our house. I do not remember every conversation that followed, but I remember that there was never a normal explanation. He had not come over, he had not called, he had not left a message. He had not stood outside our front door and said his usual greeting. Still, two people heard him. The more I think about it, the stranger it becomes because of how ordinary the situation was before it happened. We were not alone in a dark house. We were not exploring a cemetery. We were not sitting around telling scary stories or trying to communicate with anything. We were a family upstairs, talking before bed. My parents were there, my brothers were there. Everyone was awake. Everyone knew the house. Everyone knew Grandpa. Then, suddenly, two of my brothers heard his voice call out from somewhere nearby. "Hello? Hello?" The kind of phrase that would normally make everyone call back, "Hi, Grandpa." But no one called back. Not really, because everyone knew it could not have been him. I imagine that is what made the silence afterward feel so strange. If it had been an unfamiliar sound, someone might have gone downstairs immediately to check. But because it sounded like Grandpa, it created a moment of confusion first. The mind recognized the voice before logic could catch up. Grandpa was not supposed to be there. It was late. Nobody had heard the door. Nobody had heard his car. And yet the greeting had come from somewhere in or near the house. My dad calling him afterward made it feel more serious. It was not just the kids being dramatic. It was not something everyone brushed off instantly. My dad thought it was strange enough to pick up the phone and call his father in the middle of the night. When Grandpa did not answer, the mystery only became quieter. There was nothing more to do. Everyone eventually went to bed. The lights were turned off. The house settled into the normal sounds of nighttime. But I imagine my brothers listened more carefully than usual after that. Maybe they waited to hear the front door. Maybe they listened for footsteps. Maybe they expected the voice to call out again. It never did. At least, not that night. Nothing else happened in a way that gave us an answer. There was no second voice, no figure in the hall, no open door downstairs, no message on the phone the next morning. Just a familiar greeting from someone who was not there. I think that is why the experience has stayed with us. It was small, it was brief, it was only 2 words, but those 2 words belonged to one person so clearly that there was no mistaking them. Hello, hello? Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the house carried a sound from outside in a way that made it seem personal. Maybe the brothers heard something different, but interpreted it the same way because they were standing together and because Grandpa's greeting was so familiar. Maybe tiredness made their minds connect an ordinary sound to a familiar voice. But there is still something unsettling about the fact that both of them heard it. Both of them looked at each other. Both of them knew exactly who it sounded like. And both of them knew Grandpa never came over that late at night. I do not know whether it was paranormal. I do not know whether it was a strange echo, a sound from outside, or a trick of memory. But I know that for one brief moment, in the upstairs hallway near my parents' room, my brothers heard our grandfather arrive at the house. And when my dad called to check, Grandpa was asleep somewhere else. Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue. Around 2012, I had an experience that has stayed with me for years, not because anything supernatural happened in the usual sense, but because of how completely wrong one person felt the moment I saw him. I still feel uncomfortable telling the story because I know how it can sound. It was not that this man did anything threatening. He did not speak to me. He did not approach me. He did not act aggressively. He was not making a scene, and he was not behaving in any way that would normally make people feel unsafe. He was simply sitting at a table. But when I looked at him, something deep in my body reacted before I had time to think. It was one of those immediate, instinctive reactions that make you feel ashamed afterward because you know you do not have enough information to justify it. You see a stranger who looks different, sick, exhausted, injured, or unfamiliar in some way, and your brain tries to label what you are seeing before you have had the chance to be reasonable. That is what happened to me. I had been walking past a table when I noticed him. I do not remember every detail of the setting now. It was some kind of place where people were seated, eating or talking, with guests around and tables close enough together that you had to move around them carefully. It was ordinary. There was conversation, movement, people doing normal things. I was passing by one of the tables and happened to brush against it or touch it lightly as I went past. Maybe I steadied myself. Maybe I moved it slightly without meaning to. Maybe I was simply walking close enough that I had to put a hand out for balance. Whatever the reason, I looked up, and I saw him. There was someone sitting at the table who immediately made every hair on the back of my neck rise. It happened before I could process why. My body reacted first. That cold, prickling feeling moved up through my shoulders and into my scalp. It was not a normal feeling of surprise. It was the kind of sudden alarm response that makes you want to take a step back without knowing what danger you are stepping away from. The man was extremely pale, not just light-skinned, not merely tired-looking. His skin had a kind of flat, drained whiteness that looked wrong against the room around him. There was a bluish cast around his eyes, nose, and lips. The color was subtle in some places and stronger in others, but it gave his face an unnatural appearance. It was as though all the warmth had been pulled out of him. His eyelids were what unsettled me most. The lower lids hung so loosely that I could almost see the underside of them. They did not sit naturally against his eyes the way I expected. They seemed slack, heavy, and slightly pulled away, giving him a hollow, exhausted expression even though he was looking forward. His bottom lip hung down too, not dramatically, not in a way that seemed theatrical, but enough that it reminded me of the old, exaggerated image people have of someone who is completely detached from the world around them. It was one of those facial expressions that seems less like an expression and more like a body no longer bothering to hold itself together. I know that sounds cruel. I know now that many medical conditions, medications, disabilities, neurological conditions, fatigue states, and injuries can change the way a person's face looks or moves. I know people are not monsters because they look ill. I know that even writing about a stranger this way risks making them into something they were not. But in that moment, I was not thinking kindly or logically. I was 12 years younger than I am now. I was caught off guard. I saw a person whose appearance was so unfamiliar to me that my mind reacted with fear before it could form any reasonable explanation. He moved very slowly, languidly. That is the word I kept coming back to afterward. Everything about him seemed delayed. The way he ate, the way he raised his hand, the way he shifted in his seat. It was not simply that he was relaxed. It looked as though every movement took effort, as though his body was operating on a slower setting than everyone else in the room. Someone might move a hand to pick up a utensil without thinking. He seemed to move his hand as if he had to remember how. Someone might turn their head toward a voice in a quick, ordinary motion. He seemed to take longer. Someone might chew, swallow, glance around the room, and respond to the people at the table. He seemed disconnected from the pace of everything around him. That was what made it feel so unsettling. If I had seen him alone, on a quiet street, at night, maybe I would have had a different reaction. The darkness or isolation could have explained why my mind made him into something frightening. But he was sitting in a normal public setting. There were other guests around him. People were talking. People were eating. There was light in the room. The world around him was completely ordinary, and somehow that made his appearance stand out more. He did not belong to the visual rhythm of the place. Everyone else looked alive in the usual way. Faces moved quickly. Hands lifted glasses. People leaned forward, smiled, frowned, spoke, laughed, checked phones, and shifted in their chairs. He looked as though he had been placed into the scene from somewhere else. I do not mean that literally. I do not mean I think he was dead or supernatural or anything impossible. But for a few terrible seconds, the thought that passed through my mind was that I was looking at a walking corpse. It was not a thought I chose. It was not a belief. It was a sudden, ugly flash of fear. The idea arrived fully formed before my common sense had time to shut it down. I remember looking at him and feeling my stomach turn. My brain kept searching for an explanation. He was sick. He had to be sick. There had to be a medical reason. Maybe he had a severe blood disorder. Maybe he had anemia. Maybe he had some kind of breathing issue that made his lips and the area around his eyes look blue. Maybe he had taken medication that slowed him down. Maybe he had a neurological condition. Maybe he had recently been in the hospital. Maybe he was exhausted from something I knew nothing about. There had to be a reason. But while I was standing there, reason was slow to arrive. All I could feel was the immediate discomfort of seeing someone who looked so profoundly unwell in a way I had never seen before. I had seen sick people before. I had seen people with visible disabilities. I had seen people who were exhausted, injured, drunk, pale, bruised, or struggling physically. But I had never seen anyone whose face and movements triggered that instinctive, animal-level feeling in me. It felt like an uncanny valley reaction. Not because he was not human, he obviously was, but because every part of him looked human in a way that seemed slightly out of alignment with what my brain expected. The color of his skin, the loose lower eyelids, the slackness in his mouth, the slow movements, the way he ate, the way he seemed to exist among everyone else without matching the energy of the room. My mind kept trying to make him into something impossible because it could not immediately understand what it was seeing. I did not stare for long. I do not think I could have. There is a point where you become aware that you are looking at someone too much, and then shame hits. You realize that whatever is making you uncomfortable may be a health issue, a disability, or something deeply personal to that person. You realize that they have probably spent their entire life being looked at. You realize you are becoming another stranger who cannot hide their reaction. So I looked away. But I could not stop thinking about him. Even after I left the table, I kept replaying the image. The blue around his lips, the pale skin, the way his lower eyelids seemed too loose, the slow, heavy motion of his body. I kept trying to decide whether I had overreacted. Maybe I had caught him at a strange angle. Maybe the lighting in the room made the blue tones more obvious than they really were. Different kinds of indoor lighting can make people look pale, gray, yellow, or strangely colored. Fluorescent lights can make healthy people look ill. Shadows can deepen the folds under someone's eyes. A person leaning forward at a table can look different from every angle. Maybe he was only tired. Maybe he was unwell that day. Maybe he had been going through treatment for something. Maybe his appearance was normal for him, and I was simply unfamiliar with it. That was probably the truth. The longer I thought about it, the more embarrassed I became by my first reaction. I did not know him. I did not know what condition he had, if any. I did not know whether he had recently been sick, whether he had a medical diagnosis, whether he was taking medication, whether he had suffered an injury, or whether he simply looked different from what I was used to. I had no right to turn him into something frightening. And yet, I could not completely shake the feeling. That is what makes the memory strange to me. Not because I believe I saw anything paranormal. I do not. I do not actually think walking corpses are real. I do not think he was dead, possessed, undead, or anything like that. I do not think I saw a monster hiding in a room full of people. I think I saw a real person with a real body and a real life that I knew nothing about. But in the moment, before logic could catch up, my body treated him like danger. That reaction bothered me. It made me think about how much of fear is based on what we recognize. We are comfortable with things that fit into categories we understand. A person looks tired. A person has an injury. A person is elderly. A person is wearing a medical device. A person moves slowly because of a cane or a wheelchair. We see something familiar and our minds settle. But when a person looks visibly different in a way we cannot immediately label, something primitive can happen. The mind tries to protect itself by saying, "This is wrong." Not morally wrong, not necessarily dangerous, just wrong in the sense of unfamiliar. The thing does not fit. The pattern breaks. And that can be frightening. I think that was what happened to me. The man did not need to do anything. He did not need to say anything. He did not need to look at me or move toward me. His presence alone, in that very normal setting, made me feel as though I had seen something I was not supposed to see. That is an awful thing to admit. But it is true. I remember wanting to leave the area quickly. I remember feeling guilty for being so disturbed. I remember trying to force myself to think of reasonable explanations. Iron deficiency was the first thing that came to mind. Maybe he had severe anemia. That could explain the pallor. It could explain the lack of color. It might explain exhaustion or sluggish movement. Maybe he had some other condition affecting oxygen levels, circulation, or muscle tone. Maybe the bluish hue around his lips and eyes had a medical cause. I did not know. I still do not know. And I should not pretend to diagnose a stranger from one brief encounter. But creating a possible explanation helped me calm down. It gave my mind something to hold on to. He was ill. He was tired. He was dealing with something. He was a person. That was the thought I kept repeating to myself afterward. He was a person. Even though my first instinct had been ugly and frightened, I knew that much was true. Still, the image stayed with me longer than I expected. I would think about it at random times. Sometimes I would remember a movie scene, a horror story, or an old photograph, and the memory of that man would come back. Not because he looked like a fictional monster exactly, but because the world around him had been so ordinary. That was what made it feel uncanny. If he had been in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment, I might have understood his appearance immediately. If he had been in a care facility, a doctor's office, or someplace where serious illness was expected, I may not have reacted the same way. But he was a guest, sitting at a table. He was eating. He was surrounded by people who seemed completely comfortable around him. Nobody else reacted as though there was anything alarming about him, which meant that whatever I saw was probably normal to the people who knew him. Maybe he was someone's father, someone's husband, someone's uncle, someone's friend. Maybe the people at the table had cared for him through illness, treatment, recovery, or disability. Maybe they had spent years seeing past the physical details that made a stranger freeze for a second. That thought made me feel even worse about my reaction, because to them, he was probably just him. Not a horror image, not an unsettling sight, not something that needed to be explained, just a person at the table. I have never seen him again, at least, not that I recognize. It was one brief encounter around 2012, a moment that lasted only seconds or maybe a minute, but it stayed with me because it showed me how quickly the mind can turn fear into a story. I saw someone who looked profoundly ill or physically unusual. My body responded before my conscience did. My imagination filled in the gaps, and for a moment, I felt as though I had seen something impossible in a completely ordinary place. Later, reason returned. I told myself there were medical explanations. There had to be. I reminded myself that people can look fragile, pale, slow, and unfamiliar without being anything other than human. I reminded myself that illness can alter the body in ways that are difficult for strangers to understand. I reminded myself that fear does not make someone dangerous. But I also learned something about myself that day. Sometimes the most unsettling things are not ghosts, dark hallways, or strange noises in an empty house. Sometimes it is seeing a real person who does not fit the picture your mind expects to see. Sometimes it is the moment your brain cannot immediately categorize what is in front of you. And sometimes the scariest part is realizing that the fear says more about you than it does about them. When I was somewhere between 9 and 12 years old, I lived in a house in rural Washington. It was not a normal, simple-shaped house. The main part had 2 stories, but there was also a 1-story section attached to one side that held the pool equipment and some extra storage space. From outside, the attached section looked lower than the rest of the house, almost like an addition that had been built later. That layout mattered because of where my bedroom was. My room was on the 2nd floor, right beside the attached pool room section. Because the pool room was only 1 story tall, there was empty space above it. An attic area ran along the other side of one of my bedroom walls. So when I slept at night, I was sharing a wall with an attic, not a normal attic directly above me, where you might expect heat ducts, insulation, and roof beams. This space was beside my room, inside the upper part of the attached 1-story structure. It was dark, unfinished, and not somewhere anyone had reason to go often. At first, I did not think much about it. We had only recently moved in, and every new house has unfamiliar sounds. When you are a kid, especially after moving somewhere rural, you hear things you did not hear before. Wind hits the outside of the house differently. Trees scrape against windows. Pipes make noises. The roof shifts when the temperature changes. Animals move around outside. In the country, there are fewer cars and fewer people, so every little sound seems louder. That house had plenty of sounds. It creaked in winter. It made little snapping noises when the temperature changed. The pool equipment sometimes hummed or clicked. The wind could move across the side of the house and make the exterior panels vibrate slightly. My family would usually explain those things by saying, "It's an old house," or "That's just the wind." Most of the time, I believed them. Then, a few months after we moved in, I woke up in the middle of the night and heard footsteps on the other side of my bedroom wall. At first, I did not fully wake up. I remember lying in bed, still half asleep, trying to understand what I was hearing. The room was dark. The house was quiet. Everyone else was supposed to be asleep. Then I heard it again. A step, then another, not a random creak, not the short popping sound old wood makes. It sounded like someone walking carefully. The noise came from the wall beside my bed, the wall that bordered the attic area. I stayed still and listened. The footsteps were slow. They sounded muffled because they were behind the wall, but they had a rhythm that was hard to mistake. One movement, a pause, another movement. It sounded as if someone was shifting their weight over old boards or moving across a tight, awkward space. I remember thinking someone must be up there. That was the first thought. Maybe one of my parents had gone into the attic for something. Maybe my brother was messing around in there. Maybe there was another room or storage space I did not know about. But none of that made much sense. It was the middle of the night. Nobody had said they were going into the attic. And even if someone had gone up there, I should have heard them enter. I should have heard a door open, a ladder move, or something nearby. Instead, all I heard was the sound of someone walking behind my wall. I did not get out of bed. I was too tired and too confused to do anything about it. I pulled the blanket up a little higher and tried to tell myself it was probably the house settling. Eventually, the sound stopped. I went back to sleep. The next day, I forgot about it for a while. At least I tried to. Then it happened again. It was not the next night. It was not something that happened every evening at the same time. But maybe a week later, or a little more, I woke up again and heard the same thing. Footsteps behind the same wall. slow and steady. This time, I was more awake. I listened carefully, trying to decide whether I was imagining it. I held my breath and waited. The sound continued. It was not loud, but it was clear enough that I could follow the movement. It sounded like whoever, or whatever, was making it was moving along the attic floor on the other side of the wall. I remember staring at the dark shape of my bedroom door. I thought about opening it and going to get someone, but I did not want to leave my bed. I did not want to walk out into the hallway, wake my parents, and say, "I hear someone in the attic." Even as a child, I knew how that sounded. I expected them to tell me it was a mouse, a raccoon, the wind, or the house settling. So I stayed quiet. The footsteps continued for a little while, then stopped. After that, it became a pattern. Not a daily pattern, not something predictable enough that I could prepare for it. But once every week or so, maybe sometimes more, I would hear it. I would wake up in the middle of the night and realize there was movement behind the wall. One slow footstep, then another. Sometimes there would be a short pause between them. Sometimes it sounded like whoever was there had stopped and was standing still. Other times it sounded as if they were pacing a very short distance, turning around and moving back the way they came. That was what made it so unnerving. The attic space was not big enough for someone to walk around freely. At least, I did not think it was. It was above the one-story pool room extension, narrow and awkward, full of beams and insulation. I imagined it as a dark, triangular space with low rafters, the kind of place where you would have to crouch. So if someone was in there, what were they doing? Why would they walk back and forth in the middle of the night? Why would they do it so quietly? And why would they never come out? For the first few months, I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe the roof was expanding and contracting. Maybe the pool equipment below was vibrating the walls in a strange rhythm. Maybe tree branches were rubbing against the house and creating a sound that seemed like footsteps. Maybe squirrels or raccoons had gotten into the attic. Rural Washington had plenty of animals, and animals can make surprisingly human-sounding noises when they move around in walls or ceilings. But the sound was always too heavy, too deliberate. It did not sound like claws scratching or an animal scurrying. It did not sound like quick little movements, chewing, or something scrambling through insulation. It sounded like walking. Human walking. I began listening for it before I went to bed. Sometimes I would lie there in the dark, already tense, waiting to hear it. Every creak in the house made me sit up slightly. Every time the wind hit the side of the house, I would hold my breath. The wall beside my bed became the part of the room I watched most. During the day, it was just a wall. At night, it felt different. It felt thin, too thin. I would look at it and imagine the attic on the other side. I imagined old beams, dark insulation, dust, spiderwebs, and a narrow space where someone could crouch without being seen. Once that image gets into your mind as a child, it is hard to get rid of it. I started wondering whether someone might actually be living there. I know that sounds extreme, but I was young, and the sound kept happening. We lived in a rural area. There were not many neighbors nearby. The property had space around it. The attached pool room and attic area felt separate from the rest of the house. Maybe someone had found a way in. Maybe a homeless person had discovered the attic and was sleeping there. Maybe someone had been using it for storage or hiding. Maybe there was an old access point my family did not know about. The thought terrified me, but it also made more sense than ghosts. At least a real person would explain the footsteps. Eventually, I told my brother. I do not remember exactly how the conversation started. Maybe we were talking late one night. Maybe I asked him if he ever heard noises from the attic. Maybe he brought it up first. but I remember the relief and fear I felt when he said he had heard it too. He knew exactly what I meant. He had heard footsteps from the attic area. He described it in a way that made me realize I had not imagined it. He did not say he heard scratching or random creaking. He said he heard someone walking. That changed everything. Before then, part of me had thought it could be a dream. Maybe I was waking at night and hearing the house settle. Maybe my mind turned normal sounds into footsteps because I was scared. But my brother had heard it too. He had been in a different room. He had not been sleeping beside the same wall. He had no reason to know what I was imagining. Yet he had heard the same kind of movement. We started paying more attention. Sometimes, when we were both awake at night, one of us would ask, "Did you hear that?" The other would listen. Sometimes we heard nothing. Other times, we would both go quiet because the sound had started again. Footsteps, slow, muffled, somewhere in the attic section of the house. We told the rest of the family. At least, we asked questions. Was anyone in the attic? Did somebody go into the pool room? Did you hear something over there last night? The answers were always no. Nobody had gone up there. Nobody was moving around. Nobody was storing things in that attic at night. Nobody knew what we were talking about. Our parents probably assumed it was the house. That is the explanation adults usually give, because honestly, it is usually the correct one. Houses make noises. Children hear them at night and turn them into something frightening. Siblings convince each other that the sounds are footsteps. A small animal moves through a wall, and suddenly the entire family has a ghost story. I understand why they would think that. But my brother and I were convinced somebody was up there. Not because we wanted to be scared, not because we were telling scary stories. We were convinced because the sound repeated for over a year. It did not happen once. It did not happen during a storm or on a particularly windy night. It happened again and again, in the same place, with the same slow rhythm. There were nights when I would wake up and hear the footsteps almost immediately. A step, a pause, another step. The sounds would travel just enough that I could picture someone moving along the attic floor. Sometimes they seemed closer to the end of the wall near my bed. Sometimes they sounded farther away, toward the pool room side of the house. I would lie perfectly still, afraid that if I made noise, whoever was up there would know I was awake. That was the worst thought. Not that something was walking behind the wall, but that it might be listening too. I imagined whoever it was stopping when I stopped breathing. I imagined them standing above the pool room, leaning close to the wall, hearing me move in bed. I imagined them knowing exactly where my room was. Maybe that was only childhood fear. Maybe it was a story my brain made because I did not understand the sounds. But when you are 9, 10, 11, or 12 years old, a wall does not feel like much protection when you think someone may be hiding on the other side of it. There were times I wanted to ask my parents to search the attic. I wanted someone to get a flashlight, climb up there, and prove that no one was living inside the walls. But I was also afraid of what they might find. What if there was someone? What if there was a sleeping bag, food wrappers, clothes, or footprints in the dust? What if there was an old man hiding in the dark? What if whoever had been walking there heard us coming and escaped through some access point we did not know about? Part of me wanted an answer. Part of me wanted the mystery to stay a mystery, because any real answer could be worse. As far as I know, no one ever found anything. No one discovered a person hiding in the attic. No one found evidence of a break-in. No one found an animal nest large enough to explain the repeated heavy footsteps. No one found an access route or a secret space. The noises simply continued for a while, then eventually became less common or stopped. But by then, the damage was done. I had become afraid of attics, not in a dramatic way where I could not go near one at all, but enough that I avoid them whenever possible. I do not like climbing attic ladders. I do not like crawling into dark spaces above a ceiling. I do not like the smell of insulation, dust, and old wood. I especially do not like hearing a house creak from above. Even now, when I am in someone else's home and they mention an attic, I picture that old house in rural Washington. I picture my bedroom on the second floor. I picture the wall beside my bed, the wall that separated me from a dark space I could not see. And I remember the sound, a slow step, a pause, another step. I have tried to come up with logical explanations over the years. Maybe it was a raccoon. Raccoons can sound much bigger than they are. They can walk across rafters and make heavy noises. In a quiet house, an animal moving through an attic can sound surprisingly human. Maybe it was squirrels. Maybe it was rats or mice, though the sound never seemed small enough for that. Maybe the pool equipment created vibrations that traveled through the structure in a pattern that sounded like footsteps. Maybe a pump kicked on at night, and the old framing carried the sound up through the wall. Maybe the roof expanded and contracted as the temperature dropped. In rural Washington, nights can get cold, and old wood can make sudden creaks that sound like movement. Maybe the wind moved the side of the house in a way that made the attic beams shift. Those explanations are possible. They are probably more likely than someone secretly living in the attic for over a year without ever being discovered. But none of them feel completely right when I remember the sound, because it did not sound like random creaking. It sounded like someone taking careful steps. The rhythm was too clear, the pauses were too natural, and my brother heard it too. That is what still gets me. If I had been the only one, I could easily tell myself I was a kid with an active imagination. I could blame nightmares, fear, or the strange sounds of a new house. But my brother knew. He had heard the same thing. We did not need to convince each other. We both already believed it. We both thought someone was living up there. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe the attic was empty the whole time. Maybe the sounds had a simple explanation that neither of us understood because we were too young. But I will never forget lying in bed, listening to those footsteps behind the wall, and wondering who was moving around in the dark above the pool room. The house itself may have been harmless. The attic may have been empty. The sound may have been nothing more than animals, wood, pipes, wind, or old construction. But to me, it never felt like nothing. It felt like there was someone there. Someone who moved through the attic once a week. Someone who knew the house was asleep. Someone who walked just on the other side of my bedroom wall. About 6 days ago, I had one of the worst nights of my life. In a part of South Minneapolis, I already knew I should not have been stopping in. I do not mean that to insult everyone who lives there. I am talking about one particular stretch of road, one of those blocks where the buildings are worn down, the streets feel empty in the wrong way, and you get the sense that you should handle whatever you need to handle quickly and keep moving. I had pulled over because I needed to take care of something. It was not supposed to take long. I had every intention of stopping, doing what I needed to do, and getting back in my car. It was late enough that the streets had thinned out, but not so late that there was nobody around. There were still people moving through the neighborhood, cars passing here and there, and shadows around doorways and corners that made it difficult to tell who was just walking home and who was watching the street. As I bent around the block looking for a place to pull over, I noticed a young white guy running down the sidewalk with a large drink in his hand. That was the first thing that seemed strange. Not terrifying, just strange. He was running fast enough that I noticed him immediately, but he still had this huge drink in his hand. It was one of those oversized convenience store cups, and the whole thing looked out of place. Someone running at night is already enough to make you look twice. Someone running while trying not to spill a massive drink makes you wonder what they are running from. I remember seeing him and thinking, that is weird. Then I pulled over. There was another couple nearby. A man wearing a face covering was arguing with a woman in Spanish. I could not understand exactly what they were saying, but the tone was sharp. It was clearly not a calm conversation. The woman looked tense, and the man was standing too close to her. I noticed them, but I tried not to involve myself. That is the thing about being alone in a rough area late at night. You can see trouble forming in front of you and still know that stepping into it might make everything worse. I did not know either of them. I did not know what their argument was about. I did not know whether they were drunk, whether they had been fighting for hours, or whether I was seeing a few seconds of something complicated that had been going on long before I arrived. In my head, I remember thinking something like, I hope he does not think I am about to jump in and play hero. I had no interest in getting involved in someone else's fight. I got out of the car, pulled my hood up, and started walking in the opposite direction. I was trying to keep my head down and get where I needed to go without drawing attention to myself. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, I saw the young guy with the large drink again. He was lying on his back in the street or near the curb, with his legs bent upward and kicking awkwardly. At first, I could not understand what I was looking at. His movements were strange, uneven, like his body was fighting something his mind could not control. My first thought was that he was overdosing. It was not a judgment. It was just the first explanation that came to mind. I had seen enough people in bad situations to know that when someone is on the ground late at night and moving like that, you do not ignore it. I called out to him, "Hey, are you okay?" He did not answer at first. I asked him if he needed Narcan. He tried to respond, but it came out wet and broken. Not on drugs, he managed. That was when I took a few steps closer. I saw that he was spitting blood. Not a little blood from a split lip or a fall. Enough that I immediately understood this was not a normal medical situation, and not something I was prepared to handle by myself in the middle of the street. I stopped. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened to him. Then I looked back toward the arguing couple. The woman had both hands at her throat. Her body language changed everything. A second earlier, I had thought I was watching an argument I should stay out of. Now it looked like something much worse had happened. She was clutching at her neck, and there was blood on her hands. The man in the face covering was no longer arguing with her. He was walking away. I remember the feeling that came over me in that moment. It was not courage. It was not anger. It was pure shock mixed with fear. The whole scene had changed too quickly. A guy was on the ground, injured badly enough that he could barely talk. A woman was standing there, holding her throat, and the man who had been arguing with her was walking away like he had already decided whatever happened was over. I grabbed onto my things and watched him. He turned his head and looked back at me. That was the moment I thought he had seen me as a problem. Maybe he thought I had seen too much. Maybe he thought I was about to call the police. Maybe he thought I was about to interfere. Maybe he thought nothing at all and simply glanced back. But at that moment, I felt like I had become part of the situation. I remember reaching toward my weapon. I was not trying to be a hero. I was not trying to chase him down. I was scared, and I believed I might be in danger. Before I could fully react, I felt something slam into the back of my shoulder. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The pain was instant, not a gradual ache, not a small sting. A hard, deep impact that seemed to hit directly behind my shoulder blade and travel through my whole upper body. My arm jerked. I grabbed my shoulder immediately. For a second, I thought someone had come up behind me and hit me. That was the only explanation that made sense. The impact was too strong to ignore. It felt like a person had struck me from close range. I spun around. There was nobody behind me. No one standing close enough to have touched me. No shadow moving away. No person running down the sidewalk. Nothing. The street behind me looked exactly the way it had a moment earlier, except now everything felt louder and farther away at the same time. My heart was hammering. I looked forward again. The masked man was gone. 1 second he had been walking away, turning back to look at me. The next, I could not see him. I did not know whether he had ducked around a corner, gone behind a car, disappeared into a doorway, or simply moved faster than I realized. I was in pain, scared, and trying to make sense of 3 different emergencies at once. But he was no longer there. That scared me more than anything. The injured guy was still on the ground. The woman was still there. The masked man was gone. And I had just been hit in the back of the shoulder by something or someone I could not see. My body went into survival mode. I panicked. I fired 2 shots behind me quickly, more out of fear than anything else. I was not thinking clearly. I was not calmly assessing the situation. I was scared that someone was behind me, scared that I had been attacked, and scared that I was about to be attacked again. The sound made everything feel even more unreal. My ears rang. The street seemed to go silent for a second afterward. Then I knew I had to leave. I did not feel safe standing there another moment. I got back into my car as fast as I could. The second I sat down, the pain in my shoulder became worse. The adrenaline had been carrying me, but once I was inside the car, I could feel how badly it hurt. It was not just soreness. It felt deep, sharp, like something had driven into the back of my shoulder and left damage behind. At first I thought maybe I had strained something while reacting or twisting around. Maybe the impact had been a hard punch. Or maybe I had slammed into something without realizing it. But it did not feel right. I reached behind me. I had to twist awkwardly to get my hand to the exact spot. The pain made it difficult, but I could feel something there. Something thin, something sticking out. I pulled it free. It was a small dart-like needle, a blow dart. At least, that was what it looked like to me. I stared at it in my hand, trying to understand what I was holding. For a few seconds, my brain refused to accept it. A dart? In my shoulder? How? I had not heard anything. I had not seen anyone behind me. I had not felt a small puncture first. All I felt was the heavy impact, like being hit with a blunt object. But there it was, a thin dart-like needle that had been lodged in the back of my shoulder. I do not know exactly what it was. I do not know what, if anything, had been on it. I do not know who fired it. I do not know whether the masked man had someone else nearby, whether someone was hiding in the shadows, or whether the attack had come from a direction I never looked. All I know is that I had been standing in the street, watching a man walk away after what looked like a violent incident, and then something hit me hard from behind. When I reached back, I found a dart-like needle embedded in my shoulder. I got out of there. I drove away shaken, hurt, and trying to understand how fast the situation had spiraled. 1 minute I had been pulling over to handle something quickly. The next, I was walking through a dark block, trying to ignore an argument. Then, there was a guy on the ground, bleeding. Then there was a woman holding her throat. Then there was a masked man looking back at me. Then there was pain. Then a dart in my shoulder. Now it has been almost a week. I am sitting at home trying to process it all, still wondering whether I fractured something around my shoulder blade. It hurts enough that I worry I did real damage. Every time I move a certain way, I feel the impact again. But the physical pain is only part of it. The mental replay is worse. I keep going back to the moment I saw that young guy running with the drink. At the time, it had seemed strange, but meaningless. Now I wonder whether he had already been hurt. Maybe he was running away from something. Maybe he had been trying to get help. Maybe he had seen what happened before I arrived. I keep thinking about the couple, the argument in Spanish, the way I tried to keep walking and not get involved. The thought that ran through my mind about not wanting to play hero. I was not wrong to be cautious. That area did not feel safe, and I had no idea what was happening between them. But I keep thinking that maybe I was already too close to something dangerous before I understood it. I keep thinking about the woman holding her throat. I keep thinking about the man in the face covering walking away. I keep thinking about the moment he turned back and looked at me. Did he signal somebody? Did he see me reaching for my weapon and react? Did he already have someone positioned nearby? Was there another person watching the whole thing from somewhere I never noticed? Or did I misunderstand what happened completely? Maybe the dart came from someone else. Maybe it was not connected to the man in the mask at all. Maybe someone in the area had some kind of weapon or blowgun and saw an opportunity to attack. Maybe I was hit accidentally during something else happening nearby. But that does not feel likely. The timing was too exact. I saw the masked man turn back toward me. I moved toward my weapon. Then I got hit. I have replayed that sequence so many times that I can barely separate memory from adrenaline anymore. The impact, the panic, the sudden empty space behind me, the masked man disappearing from view, the dart in my hand. It sounds unreal when I say it out loud. Even writing it feels unreal. I know there will be people who think I am exaggerating. I know there will be people who think I misunderstood the object in my shoulder. Maybe it was not truly a blow dart. Maybe it was some piece of metal, debris, or a sharp object that hit me in a way I did not understand. I cannot prove exactly what it was. I only know what it looked like when I pulled it out, and I know what it felt like when it hit me. I do not know why I did not see whoever fired it. Maybe they were across the street. Maybe they were behind a parked car. Maybe they were on a porch, in an alley, behind a fence, or hidden somewhere above street level. Maybe the rain, darkness, movement, and confusion kept me from noticing them. Maybe I had tunnel vision because I was focused on the injured people and the masked man. That is probably the most likely reason. When something violent happens suddenly, people do not see everything. You focus on the biggest threat in front of you and miss the smaller movement somewhere else. You hear only certain sounds. Your brain drops details that seem unimportant until later. But I still cannot get over the feeling of that hit. It did not feel like a tiny dart at first. It felt enormous. It felt like I had been struck with a hammer. Maybe that was the shock. Maybe the dart hit muscle or bone in a way that made the pain explode through my shoulder. Maybe the force felt larger because I did not see it coming. I do not know. I only know I went from standing upright and trying to understand a violent situation to grabbing my shoulder and looking around in terror. I have had time to think about what I should have done differently. Maybe I should have stayed in my car. Maybe I should have called emergency services the moment I saw the guy on the ground. Maybe I should have kept my distance from the couple. Maybe I should not have drawn my weapon. Maybe I should not have fired. I know all of those questions are going to stay with me. But in the moment, I was not thinking like someone watching a story from a safe distance. I was in the middle of a dark street, surrounded by chaos, watching people bleed, hearing someone tell me he was not on drugs while blood came from his mouth, and realizing the situation could turn on me at any second. Fear makes decisions for you fast, sometimes too fast. I do not know what happened to the people I saw that night. I do not know whether anyone called the police before I got there, whether an ambulance came, whether the masked man was caught, or whether the injured people survived. I do not know whether the dart was connected to the same violence, or whether I just walked into a separate threat at the worst possible time. I only know that I had planned to stop for a few minutes. That was all. It should have been nothing. But 6 days later, I am still thinking about the empty street, the young man with the oversized drink, the woman grabbing her throat, the masked man looking back at me, and the sudden blow to my shoulder from someone I never saw. I am still trying to understand how a person can be surrounded by people one moment and feel completely alone the next. And I am still wondering whether the pain under my shoulder blade is going to fade, or whether that dart did more damage than I realized. Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.